Welcome to Immigration Briefing. The content of the briefing includes Immigration Department asking would-be Afghan migrants to reach out if detained in Pakistan, Canada's new immigration plan to factor in need to bolster housing and services, Canada to factor housing shortage into immigration plans, evening update, densely populated refugee camp in Gaza hit by Israeli airstrikes, Germany's liberals under pressure to pull out of ruling coalition. Immigration Department asking would-be Afghan migrants to reach out if detained in Pakistan. CBC. The Canadian government has warned Afghan migrants waiting for their applications to be processed in Pakistan not to leave their accommodations in case they are arrested for lacking legal documents. The government has urged the migrants to notify Canadian diplomatic services in Islamabad if they are detained. The warning comes as Pakistani authorities have told Afghans without the right paperwork that they must obtain visas by November 1 or face deportation or arrest. The Canadian government has reached its target of bringing in at least 40,000 Afghan refugees following the Taliban's takeover in August. Canada's new immigration plan to factor in need to bolster housing and services. Reuters. Canada is planning to incorporate housing, healthcare, and other services into its immigration strategy after experiencing its largest population growth in nearly 70 years. The country's population grew by 2.9% in the 12 months leading up to July 2023, reaching over 40 million. The government aims to better align immigration programs with the labor market to address shortages in industries such as construction and healthcare. However, there are concerns about targeting 500,000 permanent residents annually by 2025 due to the affordable housing crisis and rising living costs. The new strategy will also prioritize faster processing services for international student permits at institutions that offer better housing and support. The goal is to enable Canada to quickly adapt and respond sustainably to global humanitarian crises. Canada to factor housing shortage into immigration plans. The Sydney Morning Herald. Canada is set to incorporate planning for housing, healthcare, and other services into its immigration strategy in response to its growing population. The country's population grew by 2.9% in the 12 months to 2023, reaching over 40 million. Immigration Minister Mark Miller stated that Canada needs to better align its immigration programs, systems, and services with its labor market. The new strategy aims to address labor shortages in sectors such as construction and healthcare, while also responding to concerns about affordable housing and living costs. One key aspect of the strategy is to accelerate processing services for international student permits at institutions with better housing and services. Evening update, densely populated refugee camp in Gaza hit by Israeli airstrikes. The Globe and Mail. At least 50 Palestinians have been killed in Israeli airstrikes on a densely populated area of the Jabalia refugee camp in northern Gaza. The Israeli military confirmed the strike on the refugee camp and said it targeted a very senior Hamas commander. Israeli forces are fighting Hamas gunmen in a tunnel network beneath Gaza, where some of the 240 hostages seized by Hamas are believed to be held. Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu dismissed international calls for a halt to the fighting. Meanwhile, Yemen's Iran-backed Houthis said they had launched a large number of ballistic missiles and drones toward Israel, their third operation targeting the country, with more to come. The growing death toll in Gaza has drawn calls from countries and the United Nations for a pause in fighting to allow more humanitarian aid. Germany's liberals under pressure to pull out of ruling coalition. Financial Times. Pressure is mounting on Germany's Liberal Free Democratic Party, FDP, to leave the country's coalition government with Chancellor Olaf Scholz. Voters perceive the party as the loser in the government, with little evidence of its pro-business, small government credo in action. The Greens and the Social Democrats have dominated the agenda, pushing interventionist policies that are deeply unpopular with FDP supporters. The FDP's support has plummeted in recent months, and it risks losing all its parliamentary seats if it remains in the coalition. The FDP has few policy victories of its own to sell to voters. RAF bases set to house migrants until at least 2026. Telegraph. The UK asylum crisis will last for another 3 years, with RAF bases to be used to house migrants until 2026. The Home Office will seek planning permission to continue using RAF Wethersfield in Essex to house up to 1,700 migrants for a further 3 years beyond the initially proposed 12 months. It also plans to use RAF Scampton in Lincolnshire for 3 years rather than the originally proposed 12 months. The mass accommodation sites aim to reduce the cost of housing 51,000 migrants in nearly 400 hotels. Look at the evidence, cutting immigration would be a mistake. The Sydney Morning Herald. Australia's record migration intake is not negatively impacting the economy, according to the authors of this opinion piece. They argue that migrants contribute to both supply and demand, boosting economic activity. They point out that Australia's migration program is skill-biased, meaning migrants are generally more productive than the average Australian. Additionally, a larger population allows for a sharper division of labor, raising productivity. The authors cite evidence that migration increases GDP per capita and benefits both the bottom 90% and top 10% of earners. They argue that instead of focusing on the costs of migration, policies should be put in place to mitigate any negatives. Mark Miller lays out federal government's priorities for improving immigration system. The Globe and Mail. Canada's Immigration Minister, Mark Miller, has released a report outlining the federal government's priorities for improving the country's immigration system. The report highlights the need to consider housing, healthcare, infrastructure, and other services when planning immigration levels. It proposes the creation of a Chief International Talent Officer position to align immigration programs with the labor market. The report also suggests the establishment of a recognized institutions framework to expedite study permits for educational institutions with high standards. Canada's immigration system has faced criticism due to high levels of newcomers putting pressure on the housing market. Dam busters base asylum plan unlawful, court told. BBC. West Lindsey District Council has argued that the UK government's plans to use the former RAF Scampton site in Lincolnshire to house asylum seekers is unlawful. The council has invested over £370,000 in redevelopment plans for the site, and argues that the opportunities offered by the redevelopment scheme would be lost if the site is used for asylum seeker accommodation. The government is seeking to use the site, as well as the ex-RAF Wethersfield site in Essex, for a further 3 years beyond April 2024. Braintree District Council and a resident are also challenging the plans for the Wethersfield site. The High Court hearing is set to run for 2 days. Canada's leaky bucket of immigration? More newcomers are choosing to leave Canada for greener pastures. The Toronto Star. Around 20% of immigrants who were granted permanent residence in Canada ultimately leave, according to a study by the Institute for Canadian Citizenship, ICC, and the Conference Board of Canada. The report revealed that more recent immigrants are leaving the country between 4 and 7 years after receiving their permanent residence, with over 67,000 departures reported in 2019, equivalent to 31% of the onward migration rate. The report suggests that disillusionment and opportunities in other countries may be prompting the departure of immigrants. The authors recommended that the federal government invest in settlement services and programs to support immigrant integration and help employers retain immigrant workers. Ladies and gentlemen, it's your friendly neighborhood Dr. Six, coming to you from the 6 Degrees world with some interesting news updates. Let's dive into it. First up, we have the Canadian government urging Afghan migrants in Pakistan to reach out for assistance if they are detained for lacking legal documents. It's crucial for these individuals to notify Canadian diplomatic services to ensure their safety. This comes as Pakistan tightens its visa regulations for Afghans. Canada has already met its target of bringing in 40,000 Afghan refugees, showing its commitment to providing a safe haven. Moving on, Canada is revamping its immigration strategy to factor in the need for housing, healthcare, and other services. With a population growth of 2.9%, reaching over 40 million, Canada aims to align its immigration programs with the labor market. However, there are concerns about the affordable housing crisis and rising living costs. The new strategy also focuses on faster processing services for international students, promoting better housing and support. In international news, Israeli airstrikes in Gaza have caused the death of at least 50 Palestinians in a densely populated refugee camp. The Israeli military targeted a Hamas commander, and the fighting continues underground in tunnels. The conflict has drawn calls for a pause to allow humanitarian aid. On the other side, Yemen's Iran-backed Houthis have launched missiles and drones towards Israel, escalating tensions in the region. Shifting gears to Germany, the Liberal Free Democratic Party is facing pressure to pull out of the ruling coalition. Voters perceive the FDP as the loser in the government, with little evidence of its pro-business, small government agenda in action. The party risks losing all its parliamentary seats if it remains in the coalition. It's a tough spot for the FDP, with few policy victories to offer to voters. In the UK, RAF bases will continue to house migrants until at least 2026 amidst the ongoing asylum crisis. The Home Office plans to use RAF bases for 3 years instead of the initially proposed 12 months to reduce the cost of housing migrants. This decision comes as the UK seeks to find alternative solutions to accommodate the influx of migrants. Now, let's talk about migration in Australia. Despite debates surrounding the impact of migration on the economy, evidence shows that Australia's record migration intake is benefiting the country. Migrants contribute to both supply and demand, boosting economic activity. A larger population allows for a sharper division of labor, increasing productivity. Instead of focusing on the costs, policies should be implemented to mitigate any negatives. Back to Canada, Immigration Minister Mark Miller has released a report outlining priorities for improving the immigration system. The report emphasizes the need to consider housing, healthcare, infrastructure, and other services when planning immigration levels. It also suggests the creation of a Chief International Talent Officer position and the establishment of a framework to expedite study permits. These improvements aim to address concerns about the impact of immigration on the housing market. In the UK, the plans to use former RAF sites to house asylum seekers are facing legal challenges. West Lindsey District Council argues that the government's plan is unlawful and would jeopardize redevelopment opportunities. The High Court will hear the case, and the outcome will determine the fate of these plans. Lastly, a study reveals that around 20% of immigrants granted permanent residence in Canada eventually leave the country. Disillusionment and opportunities in other countries may be contributing to this trend. The report recommends that the government invest in settlement services and programs to support immigrant integration and help employers retain immigrant workers. And that's a wrap for today's news updates. Remember, migration is a complex issue with various factors at play. It's important to consider the human aspect and find sustainable solutions to address the challenges. Now, I turn it over to you, my dear viewers. What are your thoughts on these news stories? Do you have any questions? Let's keep the conversation going. Thank you for tuning in. The content above showcases the latest briefing reports and analytical synopses, thoughtfully curated by the 6Do team. These insights stem from a wide array of reputable media outlets, think tanks, government sources, and specialized experts worldwide. We encourage you to explore these sources for a comprehensive perspective. Keep in mind that while the content may not always align with the official standpoint of 6Do Brief, it's not meant to be taken as absolute directives for decision-making. Comprising seasoned media professionals, learned scholars, and accomplished scientists, the 6Do team embodies a trailblazing, fully independent media entity. To customize 6Do Brief to meet your professional needs, you have the option to subscribe to a diverse array of briefings on our website, 6dobrief.com. Regardless of your location, you can conveniently receive 6Do Brief via email.